What do you remember from last week that we talked about? What sticks in your head? Okay, father-in-law nailed it. And that's exactly what I wanted to write down to begin with. So you want to explain that? Try a little louder, Rob. What's right in my own eyes? Okay, so this is foundational piece here. It's kind of what we talked about last week regarding the emphasis with trying to help kids understand this. That this is the way humans function. Okay, humans function with is it right to say presupposition? What might be a better word? Humans function inside of our DNA. We function. Every individual functions with this idea that what I think and what I do, how I act, even when it's wrong, it is right in my own eyes. We do what is right in our own eyes, okay? Not just do outwardly, but what we think, how we view people, the lens with which we look at everything in life is, and this is what the Bible lays out as the foundation or presupposition of human beings, is that human beings do what is right in their own eyes. So we started last week with kind of showing examples from the Old Testament that they did what was right in their own eyes. We talked about, I don't have it right here, but it's Proverbs 21. Every way of man is right in his own eyes. And then it's interesting in the language, it says, but, it's a contradictory word, but it says the Lord weighs his heart. Okay, so even I'll read that again. And what do you get from that again? Every way of man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. Any thoughts as it relates to kind of rehashing what we talked about last week? God knows the motive of the heart. Man justifies, what we do. So yeah, we started with this idea of every man does what is right in their own eyes. And we talked about freedom. Okay, and you guys, what do you remember about freedom? Kids, what do you remember about what we talked about regarding freedom? Okay, so with this presupposition of every man does what is right in their own eyes, we humans first of all, believe that we have this idea of freedom, that I'm free, especially, I know Ronnie and I talked about this regarding, I don't want to get distracted by this, but she was talking about, why were we talking about it in terms of, Western way of thinking or American way of thinking? I highlight the American way of thinking because I think we in a very real sense are trying to take it to its extreme in the sense of Western thinking, even though this is the presupposition or thought of every human being. This idea of freedom is I get to choose what I want to do. All right, and like Michelle, you said last week, along with that is this idea that I don't want anybody else telling me what I should be doing. I don't want anybody telling me anything. Super interesting thing that we just accidentally saw. We were watching the news the other day, and the news featured this, this thing that happened. What is it, in Minnesota or Michigan, where it was a veterans group. It was a Satanist veterans group, and something had happened to where it was with the idea of free speech, they kind of forced their way into this small little town and established this Satanist monument for veterans. Okay, so this little debate was happening, but this Satanist, and I thought he clarified it beautifully. He talked about the idea of Satanism, even though it was just brief, being the rebellion against. So it was Satan. So it was this Satanist looking at Satan as the ultimate. I mean, check this out. This is awesome compared to, kind of a weird way of saying awesome in Satanism. But it was this idea of that what Satan did in his rebellion against God is the ultimate act of throwing off this idea of ultimate tyranny. So here's God as the ultimate authority, and Satan in his rebellion is this great example of bucking against tyranny, which is true, right? That's what he did. Sure, and I would absolutely agree. But what we're talking about regarding freedom, and even looking at Satan and him and his perception of freedom, or him not having freedom and having somebody telling him what to do, which again is where we're going to get to as far as this idea of what really is freedom. Okay, so I'm going to resist going there. Okay, but what I thought was awesome was this secular idea in which he is portraying. I've never even heard anybody say that before. Is looking at Satan from this perspective as if he's the ultimate good example of the fight against tyranny. Obviously, from our perspective, that's crazy. I mean, it's crazy in the sense that it is treason. It's not tyranny. This is Satan's perception of I'm being restricted. But this goes everything in line with what we're talking about regarding freedom, is that I don't want any constraints. Satan didn't want any constraints. He didn't want any limitations. He didn't want to be dictated as to what his choices were or were not. And so therefore, he rebelled. So I'll probably highlight this a few times, but what is really interesting about this conversation regarding freedom, perception of freedom, what real freedom is, I'm gonna emphasize this. You guys can tell me if you end up getting tired of me saying something along to this effect. It can be easy, and I know my experience in church land growing up is to look at Satan, look at his example of tyranny, rebellion, and whatever, however you want to assign that belief system. Look at different forms of marriage or whatever that we perceive is opposite of what God's way is, and we turn it into as if those things are these bad things out there that we want to make sure and not be a part of. And we've talked extensively about this. But what I want to show in this talk about freedom is, first of all, we have a perceived view of freedom, which is a lie. That's what I think we laid out last week. Okay, hold on, Tracy. So we have a perceived view of freedom that says I get to choose what I want to choose. And again, the presupposition behind that is I'm going to do what's good for me, and it's all based on me. It's all based on me and the self, and not an other point of view, which is we're going to get there in a little bit. Okay. So this view of freedom is completely and totally individual, as if we're some individuals that are just running around here on this earth that have nothing to do with other people. Okay, so it's individual, and it's from a user perspective. User perspective being I'm doing what I think is going to please me. I do what's right in my own eyes because that's what I think is good for me. And I don't even want to. I'm not even going to go down the, what pleases me in the sense of lust and all the bad stuff. I'm just talking, we could just even talk about good stuff. I'm going to have the relationships and not have the relationships in my life based on what I think is best for me. I'm going to do or learn the things that I believe are going to be most advantageous to me. I mean, even all the words I'm using, it has everything to do with who? Me. And like we talked about last week, if Christian and I have a relationship and we can get along and there's not conflict there, eventually there is going to be conflict there because at some point in time, it's going to contradict what I think is good for me or not. Maybe our relationship remains, but if there's a break in our relationship, why is there normally a break in a relationship? What, Sydney? Disagreement. And again, if we pull on this thread, what does that disagreement ultimately have at its somebody's not getting what they want based on the perspective of me, individual choice, individual freedom. It's good for me as long as I think I'm getting what I want. And again, we're not walking around necessarily blatantly thinking like that. What am I gonna do today based on what is good for me? I mean, we're not thinking. Those are like blatantly selfish thoughts, right? And most of you are not blatantly selfish. Most of you are not blatantly selfish. If we were to ask some of your, spouses and family members, you might see a different perspective. So we laid that foundation last week. The heart is deceitfully. We are deceived. We walk around and we are broken little deceived creatures that need the help. This is what we kept. Greg's not here, darn it. That need the help of the other big O, and like we keep on talking about in church now, God has established these relationships in church because I don't just need the help, or I should say, the help that God gives me, the help that the big other gives me is through the little O's, the little others that he places in my life, my family. And that's where we'll get into the talk about the freedom that God has created for his creatures. Yep, there's limitations, but there's no such thing as not having limitations. Okay, Tracy, what did you have? Okay, so we're going to go to Adam and Eve today. Okay, so we'll rehash that in a second. But that's awesome. So again, this idea of we laid the groundwork last week with Western view of freedom is this freedom to pursue happiness. But again, what is behind that mainly? It's individual happiness. It's not. It sounds weird when you say collective happiness. Obviously, it can sound a little strange with the way our leanings are as Americans talking about collective happiness. That gets to be scary stuff, right? But let's don't get distracted by that. This is talking about, the emphasis is individual happiness. Okay, kids. Anything else? Come on, Caleb. Luke, you're smiling. Unless you and John, whenever. What else do you guys remember about last week? Anything? Thanks for being honest, Johnny. Caleb, you got anything? Anybody else? What do you remember about last week? So I wanted to rehash a couple other things. So freedom from a secular perspective, from a human perspective, is freedom from all perceived constraints. So anybody have any thoughts on that? I want to just lay this out again. Okay, so remember the example. Again, for those who weren't here, do you remember the example? Was the 60-year-old man that, hey, he gets great pleasure, as we all do, from eating the foods that we want to eat. And he, in his freedom, is able to choose what he gets to eat. All right? And he loves his grandchildren and wants to spend as much time and as long a time as possible in his life to spend with his grandchildren. So he goes to the doctor, and the doctor tells him what? Your eating's going to kill you. You have to change your eating. If you want to spend time with your grandkids for multiple years past, as long as you can, you are going to have to limit what you're going to eat. So again, in this, he gives this example of freedom in that what's the quandary here? In real life, so in the philosophical realm, this whole idea of freedom is great. I get to choose whatever I want to choose. And it's free from limitations and constraints. But real life shows us what? And there's no such thing as having no constraints or limitations. Any decision that I make about something is going to not just ultimately, I mean, we're talking, all kinds of different, we could draw a picture out here, about, what a decision does as far as it adds more constraints and limitations. It may seemingly remove some, but like in this guy's case, what is taking place? He's free to choose, right? He's free to choose certain freedoms, but it's going to limit or constrain other freedoms. If he says, you know what, I just can't do it, I'm still going to eat whatever I want all the time, then what is happening to his freedom now on the other side? He's losing some. Okay? Another example is given, first of all, Tim Keller talks about at the level of lived life, there are numerous freedoms, but no one can have them all. Because again, choices then constrain you, either add more limitations or constraints. He also gives the idea of, let me read this one to you. Talking about education. I love what he says here. We see then that freedom is not what the culture tells us. Real freedom comes from the strategic loss of some freedoms in order to gain others. That's kind of what you were getting at, Jeff. Okay, so real freedom, even individual real freedom, comes from the strategic loss of one freedom for the gain of what I think is really profitable for me. Okay? Uh, he gives the example of if you want the freedom that comes with having a good income, you need for years to sacrifice innumerable other freedoms of time and money in order to get the best education. You will not be able to live any way you like in school. For example, if you don't say no to most impulses to go and hang out with friends and party, you will not get a degree. In the same way, if you want the varied set of freedoms that come with being a top performer in athletics or the arts, you will need to accept enormous constraints on your life. You will cede much control over your daily life to a coach. Kids, that means I will give that over to a coach. And my life will be constrained, but it's because I have a certain goal in my head that I want to attain to. I talk to the boys about that a lot regarding military. Hey, if you want at some point in time to join the military, this just is a little example, you're going to have to realize that now over the course of the next 4 to 6 years in high school, if you make certain decisions in high school, it is going to limit your ability. It is either going to help your ability to join the military if that's what you want, or it's going to constrain your ability. A lot of things happening now with social media, the advent, to use a religious word, of legalized marijuana and everything else. Consumption of alcohol is a minor. Involvement in sex is a minor. You may think you have the freedom. Again, that's why I talk to you guys, the kids especially, about that. If you guys decide to participate and choose in your freedom based on what you think is going to make you happy, alcohol, sex, drugs, those are to use the big stuff. Use speeding on the highway, okay? Or breaking or thinking that in my freedom I have the ability to choose something, but it ends up breaking the law, or something happens, you get in a wreck and you have a record of some kind. That is going to have an impact on your ability to do certain things in the future. It could be in the military or government job or any other kind of job, okay? Ronnie and I, when we were in New York, when we were back in Pennsylvania, a year ago, we sat and talked with a civilian real estate firm. So high-level brokerage people. I mean, I'm talking high-level brokerage people. And they talked about social media and a young, on-fire female that was on the up and up in the brokerage realm. And she applied for a job there. I don't remember if they had hired her. I think they had hired her, fairly new in the firm in New York City. And again, with the advent of social media, this is a whole other thing to talk about, kids, is that as they were able to watch her life on social media, in her freedom, that's why I want to keep on talking about this, in her freedom, in her choosing what she wanted to do and what she wanted to participate in, it then limited her, because her employer now on the civilian side said, that is not conducive to what we believe is appropriate for our personnel in our organization. So, again, why am I bringing that up as it pertains to freedom? It's a deception and a lie. Okay, you guys hear that, kids? My wife and I set this up perfect this morning. So, when the Bible is talking about slavery and shackles and burdens and all of those things, and it may seem abstract to go, okay, however you understand that, talking about slavery and having a master, and that's where Tim Keller goes in the book in this chapter, is that you and I, as humans, always have a master. Okay, so in your freedom to choose, you are choosing a master. Yeah, Tracy. Then go for it. Yeah, but that was like my main point this morning. All right, let's go have coffee, everybody. All right, so how do you want to say that? So first of all, let's think of a concise statement that says we're ruled by, everybody has a master. So we are, again, the deception of freedom says you're free. Let's just go to Adam and Eve now. So let's look at Adam and Eve. If you want to turn there, turn to chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis, and let's just list. And here's as we start to observe the freedom that God gives. So let's look at the freedom. So in one sense, you know, if you were to be on Satan's side and say, this guy's a tyrannical authoritarian, okay? Well, let's look at how God developed his good view of freedom for his creatures. So let's look at what he gave Adam and Eve. Let's just observe it. So God, I don't know, God created freedom. So what do we know about Adam and Eve? What did God give them from the very beginning? What's that? All the garden. So we've got God created freedom, and I want to emphasize this. He gave. So that's the point that Tracy's making. So he gave. So from God's perspective, he did everything to give. Okay? He gave everything with, this is where we bring in the other again, with the other in mind. So he created in order to what? To give. And so the first observation is, what did God give? He gave all or everything. And what did it say after each one of those things? Good. Every good. Was it? And that, at least from my perspective now, especially as we observe Adam and Eve, he's not just saying it. I think it's both and. God is saying it because God himself is saying, wow, it was good. I mean, we could talk about that from a scientific perspective, from a majestic perspective, from a glory perspective, from power to glory to the intricacies of science, what we know about it now. You look at it now from microscope to from tiny to gigantic, everything's good. And that good word is almost not sufficient for it. It's spectacular. It's majestic. It's, what other words you want to use? What? It's out of this world. It's not of this world. It's reflective of God himself. So it's good from that perspective, and it's good from what other perspective? Yes. Again, for the others. So it wasn't God just going, I'm going to occupy my time and satisfy myself and create some neat things so I can relish in them. No, I mean, this is where I think it was John Piper many years ago that I was impacted greatly by this idea of God created, and he gets it from Romans, in order to show his mercy. So it's not God created from a tyrannical leader authority perspective. It was God created, and that's what Romans says, not to just show his power and might, even though Romans 1 says every human that walks on the face of this earth can recognize the power and might of God. Even though that's obvious, God created so that he could show his mercy to human beings that ignore that power and might. Okay, so he created for the other. It was good for not just God himself, but for the creatures that he placed on this. So this idea that it's good for them. He created it for them. So his perspective of the garden is he created everything in the garden, and he gave. That's what's interesting about the words. So yeah, we already said that. He gave. So he gave. What else do you want to list? Yeah. So I mean that's a really interesting thing to bring up, because enjoyment of what God has created is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It has everything to do with who we are. Enjoyment of sights, sounds, tastes, you name it. Gave them everything in the garden. He gave them good work, or purpose. Here's a good one. Good work. He gave them purpose. The great Army definition of leadership: purpose, direction, motivation. It hasn't changed since the greatest generation. So I'll highlight the perfect environment because I bring up, and not to joke about the naked thing, but any of you, all of you know our limitations in our current environment now. Being an outdoor guy, you if you want to be naked in the woods, you can, okay? But there's extreme limitations to that, okay? From temperature to humidity to bugs to thorn, you name it, you're not going to last long naked in the woods, okay? So despite that show, all right? Well, that show may prove it out, okay? Naked and Afraid. Perfect environment. So in the garden, they didn't have the limitations that we have now as far as clothes and things like that. I mean, that in and of itself is an amazing concept, okay? So perfect environment. So fellowship, that might seem like a weird word to the younger generation, but we can say relationship. I'm preparing a presentation for this next week and came across this interesting TED talk from a young woman in college, and the whole gist of this thing was how to scrap the small talk and get to the basically the important stuff. But she's talking about the relational. How do you actually relate to a person? How do you get to the importance? And it's this young millennial that is talking about how I don't want the small stuff anymore. She talks about her first year in college and how lost she was and alone, and how she felt like she was alone and lost, away from anybody that's important to her, and nobody really cared. And she had this epiphany about, gosh, how do you, and even though she was with people. So again, her point was, how do you really connect with people? How do you scrap the small talk and actually connect with people? So Adam and Eve, fellowship, not just fellowship with God, but what did God do for Adam when he was alone? What's that? He gave him Eve. He gave him relationship. Again, not just, I mean, you could, I'll stop myself, okay? He gave him Eve. As we all know, man needs Eve. Man needs a good helper. I need a good helper. But that's not from a limitation constraint point of view. I mean, it is from a limitation constraint point of view in a good sense. Again, this idea of freedom that God created, he did all of this for the good of Adam, for the good of Eve, for the good of his creatures that he was putting there, all as a reflection of his goodness and his mercy. Anything else you want to list about Adam and Eve? So we have the environment, we have the stuff, we have the relationship with God, relationship with each other, the purpose, the work. Gosh, that's great. Dogs. I am going to resist talking about dogs right now. But they're good. No, we've had this ongoing conversation about, even going up to Mount Rainier last night. The amount of dogs that you see everywhere now, from the store to Lowe's to, dogs are people now, okay? That didn't used to be like that 10 years ago. I saw a dog on a paddleboard yesterday with a life jacket on. We saw a dog in a baby carrier, a doggy carrier. So it's interesting where our society is going. But they're good. I don't want to demean that at all. Dogs are good. Pets are good. The good purpose work that God gave Adam and it's relational. It's I do love dogs. I just don't like other people's dogs that come up around this area in the Lowe's. I wanted to tie what you two just said and talk about God giving up of himself. So now, because that's jumping ahead again, Tracy. That's okay. But that's the gospel message right there. So God gives him. No, now you may have been talking. Are you talking about like in its parts and pieces right here? Like God giving himself in this good stuff? It's all reflective of him. Okay, so if I were to have, I didn't draw a picture, but if we were to talk about this as this is, and I said this at the beginning, this is the freedom that God created. All of this good with the idea of the other, his creation. All of it as an extension of himself, as we've talked so often about as far as the characteristics. But then as we go to Romans 1, that we haven't talked about in a long time, and what we know that happened with Adam and Eve, especially with this talk about freedom, what ended up being the problem? And they wanted what? I wanted my own freedom. I want to decide. This isn't fair. That's where, maybe a lot of both religious people and non-religious people, when God created the garden, he says, hey, you can have all of this, you can partake of all of it, except the one thing. Of course, more and more, and I haven't developed this yet, but more and more I'm looking at this, this idea of choosing what's good and evil, choosing what's right for me. It's God, why it was there, God can teach us that in eternity, or why he did what he did. But again, what I believe about God now is that God restricted them from taking from that particular plant because it was good for them not to take from that plant. So it wasn't just some mean tyrannical thing. It was that, hey, look, I am telling you what is best for you for your good, not necessarily mine. Yeah, Jeff. I want to do my own thing. I can troubleshoot your decisions. I mean, everything we talked about regarding Job. I have a perception that God doesn't know what he's talking about. He got it wrong. He's giving me something that I don't really want. Again, it's this false idea of freedom. And again, it's interesting how, you think you understand a certain scripture passage and you see it in amazing light, and then you get another perspective of it. But to bring up the Romans 1 passage again, the idea for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. And then you get into what happened even with Adam and Eve, or especially with Adam and Eve. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. So God creates this freedom. God creates freedom within constraints that are awesome for us, that are within constraints that are good for us, that are within constraints that maximize us in a very real sense. Maximize relationship with other people, maximize relationship with God. It's perfect freedom. So we reject that and say, hey, you know what? I don't like that concept. And the concept being, I think this is imposed. That's not fair. I should be able to choose my way, what pleases me. And then what Paul continues to write is this: for although they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. This is what God allowed to happen. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. What was the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Now guess how he lets us live. Even though he says, look, I've given you everything that is best for you, not just from this is pure and not pure, this is holy and not holy. No, this maximizes you. And it's life-giving. Now here's what happens, and this is the point I wanted to make. Man, you are jumping the gun in everything. This is good. So it's life-giving. It's life-giving. And then he says, therefore God gave them up. He's claiming to be wise. They became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, and animals, and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their heart to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So again, we've talked about this often. So we're focused on the things and not the Creator of the things, and our pursuit of them and what we do with our decisions actually ends up being life-sucking or life-destroying. So he says, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women. You guys, usually that's talked about in terms of impurity and unholy and all that stuff. But in reality, it removes people, men and women, from life-giving freedom. And if you just look at the standpoint of same-sex relation, it is non-life producing, just from a practical perspective, in the freedom in the world that God created. God says, I created you to be in relationship with me, be in relationship with each other. I want you to populate the earth. All of that is good, both from a pleasure perspective and a practical perspective. And we say, nope, I don't like that. I want to make my own decision. So even all the, and all the rest of this list, it does the opposite of give life. And it's from the perspective of, I'm going to do what's pleasing to me, or what I think is going to please me. Is that you, Ronnie? You raise your hand? Here's the rest of them. So this idea of same-sex relations, again, it's not necessarily just from he doesn't even, I don't believe God is just saying this from some unholy, pure, impure perspective. It is not life-giving. And it's with the perspective of the self and not the other. I can't emphasize that enough. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. What's the common denominator of all of those words? Self, me, my. I'm in it for me and not the other. All of it, the common denominator is self. It's taking. It's not giving. And look at the rest of them. They are full of envy. What's the root of envy? You guys want to? Greed. I want what you have. I don't think it's fair that you have it because I think I should have it. You didn't earn it. You got it. Your parents gave it to you. Whatever the reasoning is. Envy. I'm looking at what somebody else has. I think that would please me. It's not fair that I don't have it. So now this greed thing is happening. All right. So again, it's a taking perspective. It's a self perspective. All with this idea of freedom. So envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they give approval, hearty approval to those who practice them. Guys, in a very real sense, it's not just the rage that people that are going to receive in the future. In a very real sense, God is allowing the consequences of that to take place even now. So back to this idea of shackles, guess what? If I choose that I'm going to murder somebody, guess what I'm creating for myself? Self-imposed shackles in prison. I want to lie. I'm going to be a taker. All of those, the common denominator is taking versus giving. All of it with the idea of personal freedom. All of it with the idea of I'm going to do what's pleasing to me. I don't want to tell the truth because there's an impact to me and me telling the truth and being exposed for who I really am. Isn't that, it's just fascinating. Yeah. See, the deceit of freedom, this idea of individual freedom is that you don't have a master, but you're choosing a master. That's where Tim Keller eventually goes into this idea of the gospel that guess who is the best master? Guess who is the best master, like Tracy said earlier, and we got to stop. Guess who is the only master that does not exploit you? Jesus. Guys, if you can think about that just for a second, every other master exploits you. Every other master is taking from you. Every other master is imprisoning you. That's why this whole talk about slavery and shackles and everything else in Scripture now to me makes sense. And God is saying, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He's talking from a perspective of a master who's in it for me, who's giving to me and for me. Yeah. That's right. And now he says, look, I want to be your master. I'm the real king who's here to give to you and to save you from yourself and all the other masters that you want to place over you that's going to take and suck life out of you. I'm here to give life. And that's the message of the gospel, you guys. The message of the gospel. We got to stop. Let's pray.